Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to get to talk about these ideas that are so important to me, that come from our research, and that I hope will be important to the people attending this session. So I study happiness. I actually study human thriving and well-being. And the study of well-being has really only taken off in the last 30 years. Serious, rigorous scientific study. That before that, we assumed that if our society was better off economically, that we were getting happier. If we were getting richer, we were getting happier. And so, in fact, gross domestic product was the index of a society's well-being. And then people began to look more closely and began to see that, in fact, even as our wealth in the developed world was going up, our happiness was either leveling off or declining. So wealth is not synonymous with well-being. It's not synonymous with happiness. So as we've begun to study well-being in a more rigorous way, there have been very good investigations. One of them is done by the United Nations. Every year, the UN puts out a World Happiness Report. You can download the 2022 report from the web, or the executive summary if you don't want hundreds of pages. And every year they send scientists all over the world to interview people from all age groups, all cultures. And what they ask people is, what are the essential ingredients that you need to have a good life? And what's of interest is that all over the world, the essential ingredients that people name are remarkably consistent. No matter who you are, what age, what ethnicity, what gender. And that, yes, what people say is that having our material needs met is important. So money is important up to a certain point. And actually, Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist, did a study of this in 2017, where he estimated that, in fact, as our income goes up, our happiness goes up to a point. He said that basically after about $75,000 a year annual household income, that once our income goes up beyond that, our happiness does not go up all that much. What that means is that $75 million a year of income doesn't get you that much more happiness than just getting your basic needs met of food, shelter, healthcare. So then, if it's not just money, what do people say all over the world that they need to have a good life? Well, they say that we need social support, that they need to be able to count on their neighbors. They need to expect they will have a healthy life. That means access to healthcare for themselves and their family members. They also say they need the freedom to make life choices, the big life choices. And that, as we know, varies tremendously depending on where you live in the world. One of the interesting things that people say is that they need opportunities to be generous, not just with their money, but with energy, with expertise, with time. And then finally, people say they need to be able to trust both their neighbors and their governments. And again, the trust in government varies tremendously around the world. So these are remarkably consistent findings. But when we ask young adults, what are you going to prioritize in order to have a good life? As you're looking ahead, going out into the world, getting your first job, what are you going to prioritize? In a survey of millennials, they asked these 20-somethings about this, and over 80% of millennials said that their primary life goal was going to be to get rich. Not just to get their basic needs met, but to become wealthy. And over half of those millennials said that another primary goal needed to be to become famous, which is a very strange goal. If you think about it, having lots of people have ideas about you that aren't necessarily true. And a third primary goal for these 20-somethings was to achieve a lot at work. Now, none of these things is on that list that people tell you they need to have a good life when we survey all over the world. So what's responsible for the disconnect? We believe that that disconnect has a lot to do with all of the messages we're given every day about what's supposed to make for a good life. So the idea being that the good life gets defined for us rather than by us, and it gets defined by the media. We are bombarded every day with so many messages about what we need to do to have a good life. You know, if you buy this car, the advertisement says you'll be happy. If you serve this brand of pasta to your family dinners will be blissful. So many exhortations to buy things that will make us happy. Similarly, social media conveys a picture of life that says this is the good life. So this is a photo I pulled from Facebook, and it's one of those typical photos of people having a wonderful time at a party. And if someone were coming from outer space and their source of information about human life was social media, they would think we were always at parties or on beautiful beaches or about to dig into beautiful plates of food. And that's a problem because even though we know it's not real, we know that we curate our lives for each other, especially on social media, that it leaves us with a feeling that we're missing out, that other people are having these wonderful lives. One of my teachers put it this way, and I find this so helpful, that we're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. I'm always comparing the me that wakes up some days happy and confident, but other days kind of lost or down. And I'm comparing that inside with what we all show each other, which is our game faces. We're also told by the media what we're supposed to look like. So I've taken this typical photo of, it's an underwear ad, and I've deliberately chosen a male body. Women's bodies are much more commonly exploited. But this is an underwear ad that basically gives us the message, this is what human beings are supposed to look like. You know, when was the last time that the ad agencies showed us an ad like this? You know, and yet the reality of human life is never these perfect bodies. All right, so how do we learn about what real life is like for most people? And this is where I'm going to talk to you about the work that I've been doing for most of my career now. So most of what we know about human life, we know from asking people to remember the past. And that's a perfectly reasonable way to do it. We get important data by asking people to remember their lives. But we know, in addition, that memory is very faulty, that our memories are full of holes. So think, for example, about what you had for dinner a year ago today. Unless it was a special occasion, of course, you're not going to remember. Most of what we take in terms of memory and information, we lose because we can't hold on to it all. So what that means is that our memories are full of enormous gaps. We often create false memories. We know that the mind creates added details to memories, details of what never happened, each time we try to recall something that happened to us. So all of this makes a case for following people along as they live their lives, not just asking them to remember the past, when we want to do a study of what life is really like for people as they go through time. So The Harvard Study of Adult Development is the study that I've been directing for the last 20 years. I'm the fourth director. The study is in its 85th year, and we are collecting data even as we speak. So the study began as two separate studies in 1938. The first study was at Harvard Student Health Services. It was a study of undergraduate students, 19-year-old sophomore men who were thought by their deans to be fine, upstanding young men. And it was part of a study of normal development from adolescence into young adulthood. Now, of course, now we laugh at this and say, well, if you want to study normal development, you don't study all white men from Harvard. But at that time, that's what they did. But in addition, at Harvard Law School, there was a study of boys, not just from Boston's poorest neighborhoods in 1938, but from Boston's most troubled families troubled by addiction and domestic violence and parental illness. And that study was meant to be a study of how some children born into really disadvantaged circumstances, how they managed to stay out of trouble and stay on good developmental paths. And so altogether, there were 724 boys and men from both the Boston inner city sample and the Harvard College sample. And then as these young men grew and developed, we brought in their spouses, and then we brought in their children, more than half of whom are women, so that now we have pretty good gender balance in our study across two generations, and now it's thousands of people. When people first came into the study, we did lengthy interviews with them, but we also did extensive physical exams. Workers went to their homes, talked to their parents, studied how the family operated. And then all of these young men grew up into adults. The Harvard College men were of an age to go serve in World War II. Almost all of them did that. The inner city men were on average 9 years younger, so they were too young to go to World War II. But then they grew up to become doctors, bricklayers, lawyers, factory workers, all walks of life. John F. Kennedy was part of the Harvard group, as was Ben Bradley, longtime editor of the Washington Post. And we studied them all the way through middle age. And then as they grew older, we studied aging and retirement. So what did we study exactly? Well, we studied the big domains of life: mental health, physical health. For the Harvard group, we studied World War II experiences. We studied their work lives, work satisfaction, who got promoted, who got fired. We studied relationships, not just intimate partnerships, but friendships and community involvement. And then as they got older, we studied aging and retirement. So how did we study them? Well, we certainly did do surveys. We had them fill out questionnaires every 2 years, but we also got their medical records from their doctors. And then as new methods of studying well-being came online, we started audio taping them, videotaping them. We've drawn blood for DNA, and that's kind of wonderful because DNA wasn't even imagined in 1938 when the study started. We've done brain scans, looking at how their brains light up when we show them different kinds of visual images. We've brought them into our lab and deliberately stressed them out and then seen how they recover from stress. All of this as ways to try to understand who thrives as they go through life. So then what have we learned? Well, we've learned two very big lessons from the study. The first is, not a surprise, that if you take care of your health, it really makes a difference in how long you stay healthy and how long you live. So that's regular exercise, eating well, not abusing alcohol or drugs, not smoking, getting regular health care, all of that. No surprise. But the real surprise was that the strongest predictor of who was going to stay happy and healthy was whether people had good relationships with other people. That it was both the number of connections people had, literally the number of people they saw in a given day or a given week, but also the warmth of those connections. That the people who had better connections with other people, family, friends, workers at, coworkers, community, those people were more likely to stay healthy and to live longer. We didn't even believe that at first because it stands to reason that you would be happier if you had better relationships. That's not a surprise. But how could better relationships with other people make it less likely that you'd get coronary artery disease, less likely that you'd get type 2 diabetes? Like, how could that even be a thing? And then other research groups began to find the same thing. So we knew that it wasn't just a fluke finding in our study, that this is a finding we now have great confidence in. So then we've been asking the question over the last 10 years in our laboratory, well, how does this work? So what we find is that people who are lonely have earlier brain decline, earlier cognitive decline, and earlier physical decline. That people who are lonely have higher levels of hypertension, they have worse sleep, they even get poorer quality care from their primary care doctors. This is important because now in the United States, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 people will tell you they are lonely much of the time. So loneliness turns out to be very bad for our health. Then the question is, how do relationships actually get into our bodies and impair our health or make our health better? What's the mechanism by which this happens? Well, the best hypothesis has to do with stress. That what we know is that social isolation and loneliness are stressful for us. That people who are lonely and have higher levels of stress have heightened cardiovascular reactivity. They have poorer immune function, and they have chronic inflammation. And that these conditions gradually break down and wear away many different body systems, which is how relationship quality could be associated with things that seem as different as diabetes and heart disease. So one of the fun things about following people over time is that you can track how they are as they go through life. So here's one example. We asked the same 6 questions about marriage 8 times over 50 years. How happy they were, how much they argued, how sexually satisfied they were, all of that. And what we found was that people are most satisfied in their relationships when they first get together. No surprise. And that then for most people, marital satisfaction decreases when the first child is born, if they have children. And then marital satisfaction goes back up again when the last child leaves home. The other thing we find is that marital satisfaction only goes down again after that if children come back to live at home. The other thing we find is that these good relationships I'm talking about, they don't have to be entirely smooth. In fact, most relationships, perhaps all relationships, have conflict. Certainly there are disagreements in a relationship that's at all important. And what we find when we actually watch couples have arguments with each other is that it's not the level of anger, it's not the frequency of arguments, it's whether you can see a bedrock of affection and respect between the members of the couple, even when they're arguing. And that's what predicts both which relationships are going to last and which relationships are going to remain satisfying. The other thing we can study is how we use that discretionary income that many of us are lucky enough to have. So, we're constantly exhorted to buy things. Here are all these brand names on this adorable baby. And so researchers have asked the question, are we happier when we spend our discretionary income on material objects, or when we spend our discretionary income paying for experiences? So material objects like the big flat screen TV that's sitting behind me here, or, a new car or a piece of clothing, or do we pay for experiences, a ticket to a basketball game, a trip to a museum, a family outing, a family vacation, right? And what the research finds is that we are happier, and we are happier for longer when we spend our discretionary income on experiences. So, to quote Art Buchwald, a humorist from the 20th century, the best things in life aren't things, they're experiences, and they are each other. So how does this work? Well, we find that when we pay for things, buying material objects just begs for comparison. So if I, buy this new flat screen TV and I bring it home and I'm all excited about it, then I go to my friend's house and realize that she has a bigger flat screen TV. That what we know is that the more we compare ourselves to other people, the less happy we are. On the other hand, experiences don't lend themselves to comparison in the same way. If I go to a museum with my friend, yes, other people will take a trip to the museum too, but the experience isn't quite the same. They're not quite comparable. And so it doesn't pull for that kind of comparison that makes us less happy. The other thing, of course, is that when we spend money on experiences, it brings us into contact with people. So this is a picture from a family vacation we took to Alaska several summers ago. And I met all these new people, but also I bonded more closely with my wife and my kids. And so what we find is that when we pay for experiences, we're usually getting more connected with either people we already know or meeting new people. So I've just been telling you about the importance of relationships, not just for happiness, but for health. Now I'm going to tell you the bad news. Bowling Alone is the title of a famous book by a sociologist named Robert Putnam. He did a survey in the 1980s of American life, and his survey was about what he called social capital. And what he meant by that was how much we invest in other people. How much do we join clubs like bowling leagues? How much do we go to houses of worship, volunteer in the community, invite people over to our houses, have family dinners, all that? And what he found was that there was a dramatic drop-off in the amount of time we spent with other people starting in the 1950s in the United States. And it seemed to coincide with the introduction of television into most American homes, that most of us started sitting around our living rooms staring at the screen, not even talking to family members. And then Putnam's group went back in the early 2000s and surveyed the same parameters and found that things had gotten much worse in the next 25 years. So that by the early 2000s, joining clubs and civic organizations was down again by more than half. Family dinners and family vacations down again, even though we know how valuable it is, particularly for families to eat together regularly, for family cohesion, for child development. In 1983, when Robert Putnam did his first survey, 12% of Americans said there was no one in the world they could confide in. By 2003, that had more than doubled, so that 1 in 4 Americans said there was nobody in the world they could confide in. So what's responsible for this second big decline? Well, we think it has a lot to do with these miraculous screens that we are also addicted to, that the advent of screens has meant that we neglect our relationships as we stay on our screens. And I'm sure we've all seen this, people sitting at a restaurant, not even talking to each other. They're just all texting and looking at social media. My wife and I find this. We go down to the kitchen in the morning and my wife will be on her email and I might be looking at the news, and we won't have been looking at each other. We won't have said much in the way of hello or good morning or what's your day going to be like. Similarly, we fail to notice the world around us. So this is an iconic photo of this man who is completely missing what's going on right in front of him. One argument is that we are missing our lives because these screens are grabbing our attention and holding it. So then the question is, how do we reverse this? How do we lean into relationships? And here, I'm going to turn to one of my Zen teachers who said something that I think is so useful. He said, attention is the most basic form of love. And if you think about it, attention is probably the most valuable thing we have to give each other. But one of my colleagues, the writer Linda Stone, has started writing about what she calls continuous partial attention, that we give each other our half-hearted attention, only part of our attention. And so the question is, how can we reverse those trends? And there are many ways, certainly livening up long-term relationships with things like date nights for couples, family dinners, that families can make more of an effort intentionally to eat together on a regular basis, because these gatherings are so beneficial. And volunteering in the community. One of the things we've come to understand is that loneliness and this decline in human connection is not just happening in our personal lives, it's happening at work. So the Gallup organization did a poll recently of 15 million workers all around the world. And they asked the question, do you have a best friend at work? Meaning, is there someone at work who you talk to about your personal life? And the response was that those who had a best friend at work turned out to be better at engaging customers. They produced higher quality work. They were less likely to get injured on the job. So having a best friend at work had huge benefits, but only 30% of employees have a best friend at work, at least among these 15 million workers. Only 3 in 10. Now, among those 7 in 10 people who don't have a friend at work, only 1 in 12 of those people said that they felt engaged in their job. So 11 out of 12 people are sort of checked out of their jobs if they don't have a friend at work. The other thing that is striking is that when they surveyed CEOs of companies, leaders of organizations, half of CEOs said that they felt lonely. So this is a ubiquitous problem. Loneliness is an epidemic. It's happening throughout our lives. So we've actually tried to do something about this. We formed a foundation, the Lifespan Research Foundation, that's been dedicated to taking the findings from our lifespan developmental research and putting it into programs that people can use to both connect with each other and to check in about their lives and see if their lives are developing in ways that they are happy with. And so we've constructed a program of 5 sessions where people talk about where they are in their lives. They help define their most cherished values and what their life purpose is. They look at their relationships and see whether they're connected as much to people as they want to be and how they can strengthen relationships. they look at life transitions, those big and small transitions that are always coming our way, and thinking about how they've coped with transitions in the past and how they can do so in the future. And then finally, they learn what science tells us about what are some of the best ways to respond to big life challenges, and what are some of the ways that don't work very well, and how can I get better at responding to challenges in my life. So the take-home messages from my talk are pretty simple. One is that human connection is a major source, not just of happiness, but of physical health in our lives. The other is that certainly technology has the power to connect us, but it also has the power to isolate us. And finally, that our lives, both at home and at work, really need to be actively structured to combat the isolation that's turning out to be the path of least resistance in our online world. So what I would encourage us all to do is think about this. Think about the role of human connection in your life. Think about what questions this brings to mind, and perhaps think about ways that you can bring more active connection into both your work life and your home life. So thank you for your attention. I'm delighted to have had the chance to share these findings with you. If you'd like to learn more, our book covers all of this in great depth, and we are eager to share more about what we're doing. So thank you again.